challenges, not unlike any other vocation, but when I think about it, the peace that I feel right now, I've never had this peace before in my life. And I really feel like the Lord is with me. And I think a big part of that is because I really took a chance in the Lord. Again, you gotta realize that when I did this thing, I thought it would end in disaster. I wasn't kind of hedging my bets. I just thought, well, I'll just do this because the Lord calls, and He's clearly calling me to be a priest. Hi, my name is Father Eric Ma. I'm the pastor of St. Joseph the Worker Parish in Oshawa, as well as the priest chaplain for UOIT. So when I think really far back, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is my mom. A long time ago, when she was around 6 years old, she had a really kind of serious kidney condition. She was kind of close to death, and a priest came by and gave her the anointing of the sick. And she always talks about this, how she had almost kind of an out-of-body experience where she remembers her body sort of like her soul or spirit, if you will, I guess, floating above her body. And she kind of looked over the adjacent wall and saw her mom crying there. And then so she heard this voice in her head saying, like, your mom is there and she's looking very sad. It was almost an implicit invitation to go back, to continue living her life. And so she doesn't remember anything after that, but apparently what happened is her mom told her afterwards. She woke up and was just like, Mom, I'm hungry, And so things obviously kind of continue on from there. And worked out for me because here I am, And so that was kind of like the beginning of one of many miraculous things that happen in our lives as a family. When I think about my parents, with my mom, she had a really clear sense of the reality of God and the importance of God. I always think about a study I came across a long time ago that talked about what is most influential when it comes to the moral formation of our kids. And you expect to see in a study like that, well, obviously like our parents, but the study took it one step further and said it wasn't just like, our parents, like, yeah, okay, sure, like our parents more than our friends, more than our teachers and whatnot. But what the study said was, what was essential was not so much what, parents taught, it's what parents actually believed, which is interesting because it shows that kids are smart, they know, quite apart from what parents are telling them, what's most important is what they actually believe. And kids, more to the point, they can pick up on that sort of thing. And so I knew that my mom really believed that God was real and God was the most important thing in life, Now, the downside, of course, is that, my parents didn't really know their faith that well. At the time, back in the day, my dad wasn't Catholic. He wasn't baptized. He wasn't really anything, But he was a good man, So I've said a few things about my mom, but I think about my dad. My mom was a housewife, But then when I think about my dad was a boat builder, and then he was also a real estate salesman. And what I remember from him is that he was someone who did his work with great care and great attention. And he had a real sense of integrity. He was an honest and a really good man, And I can think of all different circumstances in life when he had the opportunity to go the way of selfishness, but he never chose that. He always went the way of sacrifice, doing the right thing. And it's amazing how much that can impress a young person growing up, especially when it's their father. And so in any case, I think one of the great turning points for me anyways, growing up, was when my dad got sick. And so when you apply to the seminary, you got to say, what's the best part? What's the best thing that happened to you in your life? What's the worst thing that happened to you in your life? And for me, I remember writing in the application, the best and the worst thing that happened to me in my life was the death of my father, which sounds weird and wasn't meant to be poetic and provocative. It just was, When I thought back to what kind of made things go in terms of God's providence acting concrete in my life, it was my dad's death, And so back when I was in high school, he got really sick. I forget exactly what the condition was. In any case, there was a situation where he had a lot of internal bleeding, and the doctors were saying, look, it's hopeless. And my mom said a really short but kind of heartfelt prayer, please, can you let Carl, my dad, can you let him live until Rick, that's my colloquial name at school, graduates from high school. And the next day he was like well enough, he wasn't perfectly fine, but well enough so they could do the operation. The doctor said it was a miracle. They did the operation and he survived. He was discharged from the hospital and lived for a number of years. You know, he got sick again, and my mom remembered her prayer, and he got sick again around when I was graduating high school. And I remember she didn't ask for another miracle because she knew that her earlier prayer had been answered, you know. But around that time, you know, it's always a great privilege whenever we have people close to us who die, but like they die after a long period of struggle. It doesn't feel like that at the time, but it really is. I mean, a lot of grace obtains, not just in life from that person, but the people around them when there's a long period of suffering and anticipation of death. I think it was Cardinal Collins that says, you know, death sort of like focuses the mind, you know, it helps you to focus on what's essential and certainly what's important, you know, and that was the case for my dad and everyone else, you know. And so I remember my dad, he got baptized, he was received into the church, and obviously that was a great blessing. But I also remember the example of a priest who visited a lot. I think his name was Monsignor Gregory Smith from the Archdiocese of Vancouver. We were living in Vancouver at the time, and well, actually, no, we were living in Vancouver at the time. Before that, we lived in Maple Ridge. And I remember this priest visiting like recurringly, and I always remember that even now when I'm a priest myself. You know, like we often find ourselves in situations where, you know, people are suffering, we're trying to minister to them, either as professional religious or as concerned family members or friends. And we try to put pressure on ourselves. We put pressure on ourselves to come up with like clever things to say, or at least the appropriate thing to say. But I remember, this whole thing with Adrian von Speyer, like love equals time and attention. You know, love equals time and attention. I remember back in the day, like, here was this priest who showed up time and time again. I remember nothing that he said, but I know that he loved my mom, he loved my brother, he loved myself, because he gave us so much of his time and attention. You know, and so he baptized my father, gave him the anointing of the sick, and then he died in a state of grace. Later on, we had the funeral at the cathedral in Vancouver, Holy Rosary Cathedral, and the rector there kind of realized our circumstances, interviewed my mom, realized we weren't going to church, and he waived the fee or the recommended donation for the funeral service and said, like, okay, in exchange, I want you to go to church. You know, I want you to go to church. And so my mom said, okay, said to me, my brother, okay, it's very important you go to church every week. And you got to realize at this time we still weren't very well catechized. So, you know, I went to UBC, the University of British Columbia, to study English, to do my English literature degree. And then I went to law school in Halifax at Dalhousie. And I remember like going to law school and trying even then to go to church on a regular basis, but again, not really coming on time necessarily. You know, maybe coming for partway through the homily or coming after the homily, and just things were a little bit sketchy. When things started to turn around, though, for me there was a friend of mine named Karen Cheng. And she was a friend of mine at UBC when I was doing my English degree. And for some reason, like, she ended up in Dalhousie in Halifax, Nova Scotia, when I was there too, doing my law degree. And I always make fun of her when she sees this. I hope she doesn't feel bad about this. I always think of her as a friend I couldn't get rid of. But in all seriousness, she was like super influential in terms of my own formation and journey towards the priesthood. And I remember her constantly ask me out to things. You know, not just like Catholic formation stuff, but like even like, let's go for dinner, let's go for coffee and whatnot. And I would always turn her down. You know, I don't know why, I just did, you know, and I'll say no, and at most I'll say yes and like not go, but she just kept on asking. And you know, even now when I look back on it, like, I always feel a little bit sheepish when people say, oh, it's great that you respond to the call to the priesthood, because I think about people like Karen and all these people who just never gave up on me, with their constant petitions and their prayers and their invitations to relationship. And, you know, for those of you out there who are trying to facilitate the work of vocations, like, certainly pray, but also never give up if people seem to give you initial resistance. So I remember, like, I finally went to go to whatever that Karen invited me to, because she just kept on asking. And the thing I went to, funny enough, was a reconciliation service. So like, I'd been to public school, and, you know, whatever, and my formation was not that great. And so I'd done first reconciliation. And so, you know, when I went to this other thing, you know, still, I'd only been to confession once. And it wasn't some massive like conversion experience. It wasn't like, oh, now I'm aware of my sins and I've done wrong by the Lord, and so I should really repent and amend my life. It wasn't that. It was like, you know, Karen is in the choir. She's singing during this reconciliation service. It's gonna be a long time. She's gonna be singing to the end. There's nothing else to do. There's no great reading material here, so I might as well go to confession because it's like something to do. So no sense of nobility. It's just like, well, something to do to pass the time. And I remember going to the priest, and again, this is my second confession ever. I was in law school, you know, I hadn't been since I was in grade 2. I remember confessing my sins. It wasn't that great. I didn't really know my faith, so therefore my confession wasn't perfect, but it was integral, it was valid. And I remember the priest saying to me at the end of it, for your penance, go around and do Stations of the Cross. And it was so poorly catechized, I thought, well, that seems like excessive, you know, but real game changer. And I remember him giving me absolution, and there was this huge, massive difference between the before and the after. Like before I felt like empty and like tense and sad, and he gave me absolution and I felt amazing and I felt free and incredible. And so there's that reality, and I always kind of clung to that. And it was the first time I realized like maybe there's something more to this Catholic faith thing that I'm giving it credit for. In any case, I still didn't know my faith, and so, you know, I slipped into bad habits. I was living in an undergrad residence, even though I was in law school. I met a friend of mine named Faber McDonald, who I think, anyways, was the only practicing Catholic on my floor. We became friends. He went to Toronto, and then he went to Toronto first, and it's not that I had followed him, but I went to Toronto afterwards. And we stayed in contact. He invited me to St. Augustine Seminary, introduced me to a whole bunch of different guys. And then through that, through those different relationships, I eventually came to meet my first spiritual director, and things kind of took off from there. And so when I think about God's providence working in Toronto, like he helped me to meet all sorts of key people who were not just good examples in terms of how to live the faith, but also just really helpful in terms of, you know, here's some good books to read, here's some direct spiritual formation. So I think about spiritual directors that I came to acquire and whatnot, and that became like really amazing and palatable and super helpful, obviously. I found for myself, like, I remember a long time ago talking to a friend of mine, and she was saying, you know, what would you like to do before you die? And I think she was thinking like a bucket list in terms of like travel destinations. Right. But I've never been about that, you know? It's never like, oh, okay, well, if I went to Italy and Paris and France, then I could just like die at peace, and, you know, because at the end of the day, it's just life, you know? Right. It's kind of like, you go on online dating sites, and it's like the most interesting people are the people who do like, you know, rock climbing, and they like kind of weird foods and stuff. But at the end of the day, like, you know, you gotta be with the person in the context of ordinary life. So true. Yeah, and so my whole thing was like, okay, I just want to be at peace. I just want to be able to kind of like walk down the street or just be still in like any circumstance and just feel at peace, you know. And it took me a long time to realize that the only way to do that is to walk with the Lord, you know. It's kind of like that passage, like Matthew 11, you know, it's my favorite passage. I bought this little Bible a long time ago in Steubenville, Ohio, and it had to be just right, you know, like leather bound and like small, smell nice and that sort of thing. So I got this little Bible, and, you know, most Bibles, they have a little ribbon you can put in a certain passage. When I first bought it, I put it at Matthew 11. And the whole intention was that I'd move it depending on which passage kind of struck my fancy. But I've never moved it since. And that's I think it's become my favorite passage, and the whole like, you know, come to me all who are weary and find life burdensome, and I'll give you rest. But then the whole thing after that is like, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm humble in heart. And so the whole idea is that the Lord, yeah, he offers us his rest, but in order to obtain the peace which is beyond understanding, you have to take on his yoke. You have to imitate his meekness. You have to imitate his humility, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it's funny because in theory, when we think about kind of going God's way, you know, giving him everything and holding back nothing and having nothing out of place in that regard, we think it's going to be burdensome, but the reality is when you do that, when you kind of see if you can outdo the Lord in generosity, first of all, he'll never be outdone, but, you know, the gift that he gives you in return is his peace, you know, and so that's really been the motivating thing for me.
That's beautiful, and also that there's a sense of freedom because you are doing his will. I mean, ultimately, if you're doing God's will, that's when you're going to experience the greatest joy in your life.
I think so, yeah, because I think where a lot of seminarians and maybe even priests too get in trouble is they kind of associate the joy of the priest with certain functions. Right. You know, so it's like, I want to become a priest because I love to hear confessions, or like I like to celebrate Mass, or whatever, you know. And in a certain sense, I think that's a trap, you know, because you're not like a human doing, you're a human being.
Right.
And so again, it goes to this whole idea that I should learn to be still and to be content, So my sense of happiness and joy and well-being shouldn't depend on me like doing a particular thing. And once we start getting our minds caught up in that, we get ourselves into trouble. I remember like even at a certain point back in the day, like just changing the the vigil candles, on the side of the church and thinking like, this is really cool, And it was just a simple thing, but like that's the thing, like where does God want me to be? What does He want me to do? And if I'm being that and I'm doing that, then I'm happy.
I know that you have an adoration chapel here, which is so beautiful. In terms of prayer, what do you find that prayer is essential for you, not only in your formation when you're discerning, like the vocation of the priesthood, but also as a priest in general? Yeah,
I guess what comes to mind, it's this passage from Hosea. I think it was like chapter 4, verse 3. You can translate in different ways, but this whole idea is that my people are being destroyed, or they're being decimated even because they do not know the Lord.
Right.
And you think about the Bible, every time there's this notion of knowledge, it's always a matter of intimacy and relationship. So you think about Adam knowing Eve, and she bore Cain and Abel, right? So there's an image there, right? And so the same thing with us, And along the same lines, you think about the parable of the 10 virgins, and we often make a mistake. We look at that parable in terms of the call to charity. There's like the 5 wise and the 5 foolish, and then like the 5 foolish, like give me some more of the oil to keep our candles burning. And the ones who are wise say no, and Jesus says, be like them, So you think, what's the point of that? But it's not about that, because what does the oil represent? The oil represents friendship with the Lord.
Beautiful.
And the whole idea is that I can't give you my friendship with the Lord. It's what you got to make of yourself, And at the end of the day, I think it was Adrian von Speyer, like love equals time and attention, So like if I love the Lord, I need to put in my time. I need to give Him my attention, and that's reflected in this habit of serious intentional prayer.
Right, and that's, I think even St. John Vianney says, I look at, when he was talking about adoration, I look at him and he gazes at me, and there's love, right?
Absolutely, and you get the sense sometimes people can get distracted about that. I always tell the parish that you got to get away from this idea of hitting your spiritual targets or just kind of burning through your prayer cards,
Right.
Because at the end of the day, like, what is prayer? You may talk about like, lifting up your heart and mind to God, but at the end of the day, it's you're kind of like being with.
Absolutely, and that's beautiful because that's what you're going to give to the parishioners that come to see you, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think people forget that. I mean, it's just this whole thing with the relationship with the Lord. It's the same with any other relationship. I mean, certainly you mentioned about the time and attention thing, but we often have this image of God as being like, the one up there, that's kind of indifferent, occasionally intervenes in our lives. But a funny thing, I remember in seminary, we were in this class, and a bunch of guys are sitting in a circle, and the teacher was, I remember at the time thinking, what's the point of this exercise, But the teacher was saying, okay, everyone going around and talk about how you're feeling, And everyone was like, I'm tired.
Seminary life.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's life, right? I think it was a Monday or something. And then she says, no, just break it down. Like, what does tired mean for you, And then the guys were saying like, well, I feel this tension like here, Or another guy was saying, well, I feel this pain in the back of my neck over there. And then they went around, and you could tell it was like, okay, they all felt fatigue, but everything was very specific to the individual. And her point was that, like, that's how the Lord sees things, right? The Lord is the one who counts every hair in your head.
Right.
Right? And so the thing is, like, we're so used to, like, almost having the grocery store mentality, like, how you doing? Like, to you, fine, right?
Exactly.
But the Lord sees everything, and the Lord cares about every little detail, right? And so they kind of get used to that. Because sometimes I think we lament the fact that it's too bad God isn't like a corporal being that I can touch and I can hear His voice, right? But anyone who's even married, is an inherent limitation of that. Like, no matter how hard I try, I may bring all sorts of goodwill to the table, but, for whatever reason, I can't get in your head. Like, I can't think exactly what you're thinking. You can't think exactly what I'm thinking, heart to heart, mind to mind, right? But with the Lord, there's no such limitation, So the Lord knows exactly what it'll take, the set of circumstances, the environment, to make you think a certain thing and to make you feel a certain thing. And so once you realize that, well, I can communicate like my sadness, my anger, my joy to the Lord, and he sees the exact shade of that. And it's just mind-blowing.
So, Father, I mean, obviously the program is modified for your parishioners, right? So that they can get, you know, obviously they're being taught the Word of God.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is that just given the state of society that we're in, you know, like we're living in pretty dire straits, you know, and so like the world and the flesh and the devil are conspiring mightily to pull people away from the light and into the darkness, you know, and there's so many people who are like suffering and almost even dying in a certain sense unnecessarily because they don't know the Lord, or they've fallen away from him, or living in a state of kind of grievous, unrepented sin. And so given all that, like we have no room to waste time on things that go nowhere. And so there can be a tendency, I think, in the eyes of the church to just do things the way we've always done it, you know? And certainly I'm an advocate for like, you know, maintaining traditions and the truth. So it's not about that, right? But it's a matter of like, okay, like given the situation, like what's required to actually bear fruit, you know?
Right.
And that's the thing you find throughout the history of the church. When it comes to authentic renewal, it's like going back to like what the church fathers have always done, but at the same time communicate that to a way which is relevant and applicable to current society, you know, given the unique set of circumstances, you know. So that's the thing I'm trying to focus on. And the analogy that comes to mind, it's like going to stand-up comedy clubs, you know, and how you can have a thing where like, you can have it in your back of your mind, there's theory like this joke should be funny, except it's not, you know? And so it's like, in a certain sense, it's the purest art form. Like you go there, there's the people, there's you, there's a microphone, and is this joke funny or not? And so it's the same thing with the people. Like there's you, there's the people of God, the people entrusted to your care, and like you got a certain amount of time with them, and there's no time to waste. The situation's pretty dire, and so like let's get down to it and come up with unique, fresh solutions to make this thing work. And that's like basically the new evangelization.
Wow, it's amazing. That's beautiful. You know, I was just thinking, Father, in your testimony, you shared how the sacrament of reconciliation played a key role, because you were talking about like people that are falling away, kind of dying like spiritually, right?
Yeah, right.
So that was a huge role for you as well, that sacrament.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I think about the sacrament of reconciliation, it's been a huge influence in my life, you know. And I remember hearing this priest in the States once saying that every priest ultimately has one homily, you know. And I like to think I have two, but I probably only have one, you know. But what comes to mind is this whole idea of like going to confession and how it just it changes your whole life, you know. And I find it interesting how a lot of people they're afraid of the sacrament of confession, you know. But the thing about the Lord, you know, like you got to build your sense of the Lord around based on what you find in what the church teaches and what you find in Scripture. And a lot of times we look to other sources, like our own experience or whatever, and we bring that to the table and we construct a notion of God based on that. But when you do that, you're basing it on, you know, it's like the house built on sand, right? And so who knows if it's true or not, right? But, you know, I think about all the parables associated with the Lord's forgiveness, like lost coin, lost sheep, prodigal son, and the operative word in all those parables is rejoice, you know? So even though it sounds weird, every time I come before the Lord and like, here's my inner life, here's my inner ugliness, you know, here are my sins, he rejoices in that.
So profound.
Like he's not just mildly at peace, like he rejoices in that. And he kills another fatted calf and invites everyone to celebrate, right? And you think even about the Last Supper, and like the disciples really had to learn that. They were still riding on the coattails this idea that, you know, the Lord loves me because of what I've done or my virtues and stuff. And they got to realize that no, like the Lord loves me in spite of myself.
It's beautiful because, I mean, God ultimately is love, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what, and in his love and mercy, right? St. Faustina would say, right?
Yeah.
And it's so beautiful because that's what he gives to us, and then you especially get to bring that mercy. You know, you're in the role of Christ in the confessional, which is very powerful.
Absolutely.
To hear those words, I absolve you. Thank you, Father, for, you know, saying yes to the call to the priesthood, because what an incredible gift it is for all of us, for the entire world. Thank you, Father.
Yeah, thanks so much. In the middle of your seminary formation, there's what's called an internship year. So seminarians will spend 1 year in a parish. And maybe things are different than when I was in the seminary, but perhaps not. But what I found that whenever guys came back from the internship year, they would talk about their experience, and they would say, okay, look guys, the seminary year is, the formation year in the parish is great, because you go there, you encounter the love of the people, you get confirmed in your gifts and talents, and those things in turn will help you to realize that, yeah, I'm truly called to the priesthood. And again, maybe it's just me, but that never really did it for me. Because I didn't decide to enter into the seminary. I didn't decide to pursue this idea of priesthood because I was good at certain things or because of the love of the people of God. And certainly, don't get me wrong, I realize that there's certain things that God has blessed me with, and certainly the people of God are amazing. At the same time, the only reason why I decided to become a priest was because God was calling me to the priesthood. And perhaps I might suggest that that's what everyone should focus on if they're thinking about this vocation to the priesthood. Because a lot of times, I think maybe it's a function of the culture. We can focus on a certain sense of functionalism. My values assigned based on what I do as opposed to who I am. But you go back to this notion of discipleship as defined in the gospel. The Lord basically calls people to be with Him, quite apart from any call to mission, So in a certain sense, that's what keeps you safe. Because a lot of times we think, well, I want to be a priest because I like this particular part of the mission, or like to administer this sacrament as opposed to that. But that'll inevitably lead you to trouble. And so the whole idea is, where does God want me to be? What does He want me to do? And so I focus on just being that and doing that, regardless of what the thing might be. So again, that's the sort of thing that keeps you safe. Focus on just being with the Lord wherever He might take you. May Almighty God bless you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. God bless.
I'm very happy to introduce Shalom World, a new Catholic, family-oriented Catholic TV that will be 24/7 English-speaking television channel. I hope that through this media we will be able to continue to spread the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world, a world that needs shalom, that needs the peace that comes from the King of Peace, Jesus Christ. I congratulate all those who participate in supporting this new media, and that it may continue to reach millions and millions of people all over the world where we need the light of Christ.
Shalom World, God's own channel.